The king's dinner could spark a war or secure a dynasty. Every single day, royal chefs faced this impossible pressure, orchestrating a hidden ballet of spice, fire, and intrigue just to keep a monarch fed. By the end of this journey, you will know the exact daily rituals that transformed raw ingredients into edible power. We will walk the pre-dawn markets, decode secret sauce recipes, and witness the terrifying moment a taster risked his life for a spoonful of soup. What was on the royal menu when no one was watching? The answer is a story of survival, spectacle, and shocking luxury. If you could taste just one dish from a royal table, which extreme flavor would you dare to try? This pressure was contained within a world of its own, a culinary kingdom operating under a single, unbreakable rule. At the heart of every palace was a kitchen complex so vast it dwarfed most towns. Versailles, for example, was not just a palace with a kitchen. It was a palace built around one. The royal kitchens were a city within a city, a sprawling, chaotic, and magnificent engine designed for one purpose: to transform the king's appetite into political theater. Running this empire was the master cook, a figure of immense power and terrifying responsibility. Beneath him stretched a rigid hierarchy as complex as the court itself. There were the specialist chefs, each a master of their domain, guarding their secrets with fierce pride. The rôtisseur commanded the roaring fires for meats. The saucer was an alchemist of delicate gravies and rich reductions. The pâtissier crafted edible architecture from sugar and flour, and the confiseur produced the jewels of the table, the candied fruits and delicate sweetmeats. Then came the army of apprentices, kitchen porters, and scullery boys, an endless stream of labor to wash, chop, haul, and stoke. Every person had a place, and every movement was part of a choreographed dance. But one office stood apart from all others, a small room of profound gravity. This was the bouche du roi, the king's mouth, or the tasting office. Its staff were not merely servants, they were human safeguards. Before any dish ever reached the royal presence, it passed through their hands. A senior officer would take a portion, taste it carefully, and then wait. This was the most silent and tense moment in the entire daily ritual. Only after a predetermined amount of time had passed with no ill effect would the dish be cleared for its final, sacred journey. This entire machine, from the lowest vegetable scrubber to the royal taster, awoke each day to perform a single daily miracle. And it all began not with fire, but with a journey into the cold, dark streets long before the sun rose. The kitchen's heartbeat began in the silent dark, long before the first fire was lit. While the palace slept, two separate rituals unfolded with urgent precision, setting the entire day's operation in motion. Outside the walls, a select group of trusted servants, the market runners, vanished into the sleeping city. They carried not shopping baskets, but ledgers and sealed purses of gold. Their lists were monumental, specifying not just quantities but qualities, the exact provenance of every item. The oysters must be from a specific bed, the asparagus of a particular thickness, the peaches blushed with just the right hue. They were buying for a palate that could not be disappointed, bargaining with merchants who knew their royal client and priced accordingly. This was high-stakes procurement, where a single subpar lettuce or a slightly tired pheasant could mean a chef's disgrace. At the very same hour inside the palace, a different kind of order was being received. The master cook, perhaps still rubbing sleep from his eyes, would stand before the chamberlain or the lord steward. This court official delivered the day's sacred text, the menu. It was rarely a simple matter of the king's cravings. It was a document shaped by politics, by calendar, and by delicate health. Was there a foreign ambassador to impress? Then the dishes must showcase national luxury. Was the monarch feeling unwell? Then the food must be light, restorative, yet still impeccably royal. Was it a fast day decreed by the church? Then the kitchen must perform its greatest magic, creating a feast of fish and vegetables so splendid it mocked the very idea of meat. The master cook would absorb these orders, his mind already racing through inventories, staffing, and timing. He had to translate a courtier's polite request into a battalion's worth of chopping, roasting, and saucing. One document sent men into the dark streets with gold, the other summoned an army to its stations. And between these two moments, in that quiet, anxious space, the day's first and most critical question hung in the air: would the market yield what the menu demanded? The answer to that anxious question arrived not on paper, but in a roaring, crackling mountain of fuel. The royal kitchen's true lifeblood was not the food itself, but the fire that cooked it. And this was no simple matter of burning logs. The choice of fuel was a secret ingredient, a silent flavor agent as crucial as any spice. For the grand roasts that were the centerpiece of any royal feast, the wood was selected with the care of a winemaker choosing a grape. Apple wood might be chosen for its sweet, subtle smoke to complement a suckling pig. Cherry wood could impart a fruity richness to venison. Dense, slow-burning oak was reserved for the largest joints of beef, infusing them with a deep, hearty aroma. This was culinary alchemy long before the food even touched the heat. But flavor was only half the story. The sheer scale of consumption was staggering. A single day's service for a king like Louis XIV could consume the equivalent of an entire forest's worth of timber. Behind the scenes, a forgotten army of woodcutters, coal carriers, and charcoal burners worked in perpetual motion. Their sole purpose was to feed the endless, gaping maws of the kitchen hearths, ensuring the fires never, ever died. This relentless demand for heat spurred remarkable kitchen technology. Massive mechanical spits, turned by clockwork or by poor kitchen boys in a dog wheel, ensured every side of a haunch of meat was perfectly bathed in heat. Enclosed stoves, ancestors of our modern ovens, allowed for more controlled baking. There were specialized ovens just for bread, others for pastries, and even separate hearths for boiling, frying, and simmering. Each flame had a purpose, and each purpose demanded a different kind of fire. This orchestrated inferno transformed raw, cold ingredients, but the next step was where true artistry and terrifying risk began. While the fires roared to life for the grand meals to come, the monarch's own day began in comparative quiet. The sovereign's breakfast was a fascinating contradiction, a moment where the immense machinery of the royal kitchen briefly shifted to a lower, more intimate gear. This first meal of the day was often a private affair, less about political spectacle and more about personal sustenance, offering us a rare glimpse behind the curtain of ceremony. Consider the stark contrast between two powerful rulers. Queen Victoria, presiding over a vast empire, was famously modest in her morning habits. Her breakfast might consist of a simple boiled egg, toast, and tea, served without fanfare. It was a meal of comforting routine, a small island of normalcy in an ocean of state duty. Decades earlier, however, the Sun King Louis XIV likely required a heartier start to fuel his famously rigorous daily schedule of governing, hunting, and court appearances. His breakfast, while still private, could include cold meats, bread, and perhaps a restorative wine or ale. These personal preferences cut through the uniform grandeur, reminding us that beneath the crown was a person who might simply be hungry. Common items across many royal breakfast tables included various breads, ale or wine, which were often safer to drink than water, cold cuts of meat from the previous night's feast, and a warm, simple pottage, a thick soup of grains and vegetables. This meal was typically taken in the monarch's private chambers, away from the staring eyes of the court. There were no elaborate tasting rituals for every single dish, though basic precautions remain. This relative simplicity makes the royal breakfast a uniquely telling window. It strips away the layers of state obligation, if only for a moment, revealing the individual tastes and habits that official banquets were designed to conceal. The quiet clink of a spoon in a private chamber tells a different story than the trumpets announcing a state supper. But this moment of calm was always fleeting, for the kitchen below was already building toward its first great public performance of the day, a meal where privacy vanished entirely. That quiet breakfast was the calm before a culinary storm. As mid-morning arrived, the royal kitchen transformed into a battlefield of flavor, a roaring, steaming, intensely focused world where the day's main event, the grand dinner, began its final, frantic assembly. This was not an evening meal as we know it. For centuries, the principal royal dinner was served in the early afternoon, a sprawling, multi-hour spectacle that was the absolute center of the court's day. And every single ingredient, every flame, and every pair of hands now converged on that single, terrifying deadline. The scale of butchery alone was staggering. Imagine entire sides of beef, whole deer, and flocks of geese being maneuvered by teams of men. Specialist rôtisseurs seasoned these colossal joints with precise mixtures of salt, imported spices, and herbs before wrestling them onto the heavy iron spits that would turn for hours before the roaring, specialized fires. In another quarter, the sauce chefs worked with the quiet intensity of chemists. A single, perfect sauce could require a dozen ingredients and hours of patient reduction, a process where a moment's inattention could mean a scorched, ruined batch and unimaginable disgrace. Their stations were a forest of simmering pots, each containing a different foundational broth, a wine reduction, or a delicate emulsion. Meanwhile, the pastry department was an architect's workshop. Dozens of pies, both savory and sweet, were being constructed not just as food, but as fortresses. Their thick, durable crusts, called coffins, were designed to preserve the contents for days, but for the royal table they were also edible displays, often molded into intricate shapes or adorned with elaborate pastry sculptures. But the true marvel, the pieced resistance that had nothing to do with nourishment and everything to do with awe, was the subtlety. This was an edible centerpiece, a sculpture made from sugar, marzipan, or even rendered fat. It could be a miniature castle, a scene from mythology, or a model of the king's favorite ship. Crafted by the most artistic confectioners, the subtlety was a symbol of the kingdom's wealth and the kitchen's limitless skill, a delicious lie made entirely to be admired before perhaps being tasted. This orchestrated chaos, this symphony of chopping, sizzling, and sculpting, had one ultimate destination, and getting the food there was a logistical puzzle as complex as its creation. The symphony of the kitchens was only possible because of its silent, foundational partner, the royal larder. This was not a simple pantry, but a fortified treasure vault, a kingdom of flavor locked away from the chaos of the fires. To step inside was to take a global tour without leaving the palace walls. On high shelves, in tightly sealed ceramic jars and wooden casks, sat fortunes in exotic spices. Saffron, more valuable by weight than gold, lent its sunset hue and delicate aroma to royal broths. Black pepper, a currency in its own right, filled sacks alongside fragrant cinnamon from Ceylon, pungent cloves from distant islands, and nutmeg guarded as fiercely as state secrets. These were the crown jewels of taste, symbols of a realm's reach and wealth. Nearby, gleaming mountains of refined white sugar and incredible luxury awaited the confectioner's art, while barrels held precious dried fruits, figs from the Mediterranean and apricots from the Orient, ready to sweeten both savory dishes and elaborate desserts. Jars of preserves captured summer berries and autumn fruits to defy the barren winter months. Yet this hoard of global delicacies existed alongside the vibrant, fleeting bounty of the local land. Each morning's market run brought in the opposite, the fresh and the seasonal, carts laden with just picked greens, newly caught river fish, still warm eggs, and ripe fruits from the palace's own orchards. This daily dance between the permanent global treasury and the perishable local harvest defined the royal palate. Guarding this entire edible empire was a figure armed not with a knife, but with a ledger, the clerk of the kitchen. His duty was obsessive accounting. Every ounce of saffron, every sack of flour, every preserved lemon was meticulously recorded, its use justified, its remainder counted. He was the financial conscience of the feast, a barrier against waste, and more importantly, against theft. Under his watchful eye, the larder's treasures were doled out with precise parsimony, for even a king's kitchen could not run on chaos alone. It ran on controlled, audited abundance, a river of ingredients flowing from this vault to the waiting hands of chefs, where the final, most delicate transformation would begin. From this treasury of global spices and local harvest came a dish so fundamental, it was the culinary equivalent of air, present at nearly every meal from the royal chamber to the servants' hall. This was pottage, the universal foundation of the pre-modern table. To our modern ears, the word might sound humble, even dull, but within its simple concept lay a universe of possibility, a perfect mirror to the stark hierarchies of palace life. In its most basic form, served to the vast army of kitchen scullions and stable hands, pottage was a thick, sustaining gruel. It was a practical alchemy of whatever was plentiful and cheap, a cauldron of barley or oats simmered with turnips, leeks, and beans, perhaps enriched with a bit of bacon fat or a bony scrap of meat. This was fuel, plain and simple, designed to fill bellies and provide strength for long hours of labor. But the moment that same culinary concept ascended to the high table, it underwent a metamorphosis as dramatic as a caterpillar becoming a butterfly. The royal pottage was a dish of exquisite luxury, a canvas upon which the kitchen's wealth and skill were lavishly displayed. The coarse grains were replaced by the finest white bread, soaked and sieved to create a smooth, velvety base. The water transformed into rich meat broths, boiled for hours from capons, veal, or venison. Then came the spices, those precious jewels from the larder, saffron for golden color and distinct flavor, grains of paradise for a peppery warmth, and ginger for a bright, fiery note. For days of religious fasting, when meat was forbidden, the chefs performed their greatest sleight of hand. They created white pottages, where the richness came from ground almonds, painstakingly pounded and strained to produce a creamy, luxurious almond milk, then thickened with rice or bread and sweetened with sugar and rosewater. A royal pottage might be studded with diced loin of rabbit, tender morsels of chicken, or even delicate little meatballs. It could be garnished with edible flowers, fried almonds, or a sprinkle of cinnamon sugar. This single category of dish, from the servant's sturdy gruel to the monarch's spiced and gilded masterpiece, tells us something profound about daily royal life. The pottage was the constant, the reliable baseline. It was nourishing, easily digestible, and endlessly adaptable to the calendar, the king's health, and the kitchen's inventory. While the spectacular roasts and subtleties captured all the attention, the royal pottage was the quiet, daily proof of the kitchen's true purpose: to sustain the body of the king with a dependable, yet never ordinary devotion. It was the edible equivalent of a deep, steady breath before the theatrical performance of the grand dinner began. And that performance demanded a centerpiece so monumental, it was an event in itself. But no single pottage, no matter how luxurious, could anchor the royal table alone. The true centerpiece, the undeniable monarch of the feast, was meat. In a world where calories were hard-won and protein was power, the quantity and variety of flesh on display was the most direct, visceral symbol of a king's wealth and dominion. This was not a simple choice between chicken or beef. The royal larder presented a staggering edible menagerie. There was the noble venison, hunted from the king's own forests, a privilege of land ownership. There was wild boar, a dangerous and prestigious catch, its rich, dark meat a trophy of the hunt. From the skies and waters came extravagant birds, swans, and peacocks, their meat often considered coarse and dry, but their visual impact was unparalleled. And then there were the staples of the farmyard, great sides of beef and whole mutton, along with flocks of geese, ducks, and every manner of poultry. Each creature represented a different facet of the kingdom, from the wild frontier to the managed estate, all converging on the royal spit. The cooking method was a declaration in itself. Roasting before an open fire was the most prestigious technique, reserved for the finest, most tender cuts. It was a spectacle of crackling fat and aromatic smoke, a direct link to the primal mastery of flame. The massive joints, skewered on iron spits, required constant back-breaking turning to cook evenly, a job often done by a young kitchen boy walking inside a large wooden wheel, like a human hamster powering the royal dinner. For truly colossal feasts, like a coronation or a wedding, boiling was the practical choice. Enormous cauldrons, big enough to bathe in, would simmer for days, tenderizing whole oxen or dozens of geese to feed the multitudes. And then there was the pie, a marvel of edible engineering. More than just food, it was a durable container, a coffin of thick, hard pastry designed to preserve its contents for days or even weeks on long journeys. For the king's table, these coffins were transformed into grand sculptures, filled with a medley of meats, dried fruits, and spices, a self-contained feast that could be presented as a castle, a ship, or a heraldic emblem. Yet the final act for the most spectacular dishes happened not in the kitchen's heat, but in the cool stillness of the presentation chamber. A skilled team of artisans, sometimes the cooks themselves, would perform the art of redressing. A roasted peacock, its flesh cooked within, would have its stunning plumage carefully removed before cooking, preserved, and then meticulously reaffixed to the glazed bird. It would be posed with its tail fanned in full glory, its beak gilded with gold leaf, appearing not as food, but as a living emblem of beauty miraculously gracing the table. A swan might be refeathered and given a crown of pastry. This was the ultimate illusion, transforming a cooked carcass back into a symbol of untamed majesty. The message was clear. The king's power was so absolute, it could command nature itself to appear perfect, even in death, for his pleasure. This theatrical presentation was the final layer of meaning atop the mountain of meat, a reminder that every bite served was first a statement of absolute control. Yet all this magnificent meat and theatrical presentation risked being a hollow spectacle without its final, essential partner. The true alchemy of the royal table, the element that could elevate a simple roast to an unforgettable experience, happened not over the roaring fire, but in the quiet, simmering pots of the sauce chef. The saucier was the unsung philosopher of the kitchen, a master of transformation who worked in whispers of steam and the careful balance of flavors. His craft was the ultimate mark of high cuisine, for a perfect sauce was a liquid jewel, a sign of both immense wealth and refined taste. At its most practical, a rich, heavily spiced sauce served a vital purpose. In an era before reliable refrigeration, meats preserved by salting, smoking, or long aging could develop strong, sometimes off-putting flavors. A powerful sauce, vibrant with vinegar, wine, and expensive spices, acted as a delicious mask, harmonizing and elevating the underlying taste. But more than that, it was a blatant display of luxury. Every drop contained a fortune. Consider cameline sauce, a fiery, brick-red paste beloved in medieval courts. Its base was not stock, but fine, costly cinnamon, pounded and mixed with ginger, cloves, and grains of paradise, then thinned with vinegar and breadcrumbs. It was essentially a sauce made from spices alone, an almost unimaginable extravagance poured over game or meat pies. Then there was the bright, sharp verjuice sauce. Verjuice was the tart, unfermented juice of sour grapes or crab apples, a staple of the royal larder that provided a clean, acidic punch. It cut through the richness of fatty meats and was the foundation for many green herb sauces, a vibrant counterpoint to the dark roasts. But perhaps the most technically dazzling were the white sauces, emblems of purity and sophistication. These were not based on modern roux, but on intricate emulsions and thickeners. Ground almonds, soaked and strained into a rich milk, could form the base of a creamy, luxurious sauce for fast-day fish or chicken. Bread, crusts removed, and the soft interior soaked in broth or milk would be sieved repeatedly to create a velvety, smooth thickener known as panade. The saucier would then slowly incorporate this panade into his simmering broths, whisking constantly to achieve a perfect, lump-free consistency, perhaps finishing it with a splash of rosewater or a sprinkle of sugar. His station was a library of reductions, each pot a chapter in a book of flavor, reducing gallons of broth down to cups of intense, glistening essence. A single mistake, a moment of scorch or a broken emulsion, meant starting over with time and precious ingredients wasted. The saucier's art was one of patience, precision, and profound knowledge, turning the king's bounty into something greater than the sum of its parts. While the carvers presented the majesty of the hunt, the saucier presented the depth of the kingdom's knowledge, one perfect, fragrant spoonful at a time. But the king's command over nature faced its most creative challenge not in the hunt, but on the calendar. For nearly half the year, the church mandated days of abstinence from meat. Every Friday, throughout the 40 days of Lent, and during the penitential season of Advent, the royal table underwent a profound transformation. The roaring spits fell silent, the great haunches of venison vanished, and the kitchen faced its ultimate test, to create a feast of fish and vegetables so magnificent it made the court forget about meat entirely. This was the fish day dilemma, a puzzle of faith, flavor, and fabulous expense. The solution began with the most prestigious catch freshwater fish from the king's own stocked ponds and rivers. A massive pike, its flesh firm and white, was a treasure. It could be poached whole and presented on a sea of shimmering parsley sauce, or its flesh might be pounded into delicate quenelles. Elaborate pies were filled with layers of carp, eel, and perch, spiced with expensive saffron and ginger to proclaim their luxury. For coastal courts, the bounty of the sea arrived, but preserving it was an art. Salt cod, dried as hard as wood, required days of soaking and careful preparation to become edible, yet it was a vital staple, a symbol of the kingdom's trade networks. Yet the royal kitchen's genius truly shone in its deceptive arts. To comfort a court accustomed to meat, the chefs became masters of illusion. They crafted mock eggs by shaping a paste of pounded fish and almond milk into perfect ovals, poaching them gently, and presenting them in carved eggshells. A ham could be sculpted from the finest salmon, seasoned and pressed to mimic the texture and appearance of the forbidden pork. Rich, meat-like stews were conjured from mushrooms, walnuts, and elaborate spicing. These creations were more than just food. They were a display of the kitchen's intellectual dominion. They proved that even when bound by divine law, the king's table would not be deprived of spectacle or surprise. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Our power is so complete, we can make fish taste like a feast and turn piety into performance. The ultimate illusion of royal power was not carved from stone, but sculpted from sugar. After the fish and the pies, after the roasts and the sauces, came the moment of pure, edible theater known as the subtlety. This was not merely a dessert, it was a punctuation mark made of food, a grand, symbolic sculpture presented to mark the transition between the many courses of a state banquet. Crafted from malleable, precious materials like sugar plate, almond marzipan, or even sculpted pastry, these centerpieces were feats of culinary architecture. Imagine a fully detailed model of the king's favorite warship, its sails made of wafer-thin sugar, floating on a sea of blue-tinted almond cream. Picture an entire castle with sugar turrets, complete with tiny marzipan knights defending its walls. These were allegorical scenes, too, depicting virtues like justice or fortitude, or celebrating a recent military victory. Their purpose was awe. As servants carried these shimmering, fragile wonders into the hall, all conversation would halt. The subtlety was a direct, delicious message. It said our kingdom's wealth is so vast, we can turn the most expensive commodity into a temporary toy. It proclaimed the chef's skill so divine, he rivals the royal sculptor, and it demonstrated the monarch's command over the natural world, bending sweet substances into symbols of his reign. While some subtleties, especially those made of marzipan, were eventually broken apart and eaten by the courtiers, their primary function was spectacle. They existed to be admired, discussed, and remembered, a fleeting monument to an empire of taste that could be built and consumed in a single, glorious evening. Yet all this artistry, from the subtlety to the sauce, converged on a single, silent moment of profound danger. Before any dish could be admired for its beauty or savored for its flavor, it had to pass through the most terrifying gatekeeper of all, the royal taster. This was not a mere formality. It was a daily ritual where dining met destiny, and the kitchen's creations were scrutinized not just for taste, but for treachery. The fear of poison was a shadow that never left the throne, a constant, chilling whisper in the opulent halls. To counter it, an elaborate, almost mystical protocol was born. At its heart was the official taster, a high-ranking servant whose life was literally on the line with every meal. His role was one of grim sacrifice, a human shield for the monarch. In a private chamber, away from the public eye, he would receive a portion from every single dish destined for the king's table. He would eat, he would drink, and then he would wait. The entire court held its breath during this agonizing pause. a predetermined span of time where any hidden toxin was expected to reveal itself. But faith in human sacrifice alone was not enough. The ritual was often bolstered by objects believed to possess miraculous protective powers. A prized centerpiece on the sideboard might be a goblet carved from what was thought to be unicorn horn, actually the spiraled tusk of a narwhal. It was believed that this magical material would sweat, change color, or even neutralize poison if a toxic substance was placed within it. Similarly, a bezoar stone, a rare calcified mass formed in the stomachs of certain animals, was treated as a universal antidote, often placed in the king's cup or worn as an amulet by the taster himself. These objects were scientific nonsense, but they were psychological armor, tangible symbols of protection in a world of invisible threats. The ceremony reached its peak with the actual serving. Dishes were brought to the royal presence under heavy, locked covers, often sealed with the chef's personal stamp to prove they hadn't been tampered with after leaving the kitchen. Only in front of the king would a senior steward lift the lid with a flourish, revealing the masterpiece within. This final unveiling was a drama of trust and terror. For the master cook watching from the shadows, this was the culmination of his daily burden. His skill could win him fame, but a single failure, whether from a careless ingredient or a hidden enemy's plot, would mean not just disgrace, but a traitor's death. The exquisite flavors, the stunning presentations, all rested on this knife's edge of absolute security. Every meal was a potential masterpiece, and every masterpiece was a potential weapon. The final, terrifying taste was merely the prelude to a grander performance. Once a dish was declared safe, it embarked on its last journey from the kitchen's heat to the hall's splendor, a journey governed by a military precision known only to the palace servants. This was the ballet of the servers, a silent, swift, and breathtakingly complex operation. Led by the Lord Steward or Chief Butler, a procession would form in the stone-flagged corridors, a human chain of power and protocol. The highest-ranking servants carried the most precious items, the royal salt cellar, a jewel-encrusted masterpiece, and the king's personal napkin. Behind them came the wave of food-bearers, each knowing their exact place in the order. They moved not at a run, but with a swift, gliding pace, their faces expressionless masks of concentration. The air hummed with whispered commands and the soft shuffle of leather soles on stone. The order of dishes was a language in itself. It followed a strict hierarchy of prestige, not personal preference. First came the pottages and boiled meats, the foundational courses. Then the grand roasts, borne aloft like trophies on massive silver platters. Next, the delicate fried dishes and elaborate pies. Finally, the sweet subtleties and fruits. This sequence was unchangeable, a culinary liturgy performed day after day. As the double doors to the hall swung open, the silent procession met a wall of sound and scent. The dining hall was a universe of sensory overload. Dozens of wax candles, their light multiplied by mirrored walls and silver plate, cast a shimmering, smoky glow. The air was thick with the perfume of roasted meats, spiced wines, and the faint, sweet decay of flowers woven into garlands. Hundreds of courtiers, resplendent in silk and jewels, created a constant murmur of conversation, laughter, and the clatter of their own lesser plates. Into this cacophony, the servers wove their silent paths. They approached the high table with reverent bows, presenting each platter for the royal inspection. But before the king could even lift a finger, one last public ritual remained, the assay. A senior officer, often the same who tasted in private, would step forward. With a clean knife, He would cut a small piece from the very dish before the monarch. He would eat it, sip the accompanying wine, and then bow, signaling the all clear. Only then would the stewards begin to carve and serve the king his portion, while the rest of the magnificent platter was sent down to be shared by the favored courtiers at the lower tables. This public assay transformed a private safety check into a powerful spectacle of loyalty and protection, a daily theater where every bite affirmed the king's sacred place at the center of an edible universe. The spectacle of the royal dinner ended, but the mountain of food remained. Every banquet created a tidal wave of leftovers, a logistical challenge that sparked its own intricate, hidden economy. This was not mere waste disposal. It was a deliberate system of power, a cascade of favor that flowed from the king's own plate down through the very walls of the palace. The first and most privileged redistribution happened almost instantly. As platters were cleared from the high table, the choicest remnants, a succulent slice of venison barely touched, the crispiest skin from the capon, were swiftly whisked away by senior stewards. These prime morsels were reserved as gifts, tangible tokens of royal favor, delivered to the chambers of a trusted advisor, a visiting diplomat, or a particularly beloved mistress. To receive the king's own meat was to receive a piece of his grace, a delicious symbol of your place in his inner circle. Next, the feast trickled down to the vast army of household officers and mid-ranking servants. The clerks, the guards, the musicians, and the artisans who maintained the palace would receive their share in designated halls. Here, the food was still magnificent by any common standard. A hearty stew made from the carved bones and trimmings, pies with slightly less luxurious fillings, and bread that was merely a day old. This was a calculated perk, a way to pay loyalty with luxury and ensure the palace's own machinery remained well-oiled and content. Further down the chain, the kitchen servants and scullions who had cooked and hauled this bounty finally got to taste the fruits of their labor, often in the form of a thick, communal pottage enriched with whatever scraps were left. But the journey of the royal dinner did not stop at the servants' entrance. What remained, the bones boiled clean of their marrow, the trenchers of stale bread used as plates, the pots of gravy and vegetable ends, was gathered into vast vats. These were carried to the palace gates, where a silent, expectant crowd gathered daily. For the city's destitute, this was not charity, it was a vital lifeline. The king's leftovers, transformed into a thin but nourishing gruel, were doled out as alms. This public distribution was itself a powerful political act, a performance of benevolence that cemented the monarch's image as the provider for all his people, from the highest duke to the lowest beggar. Thus, a single peacock consumed at the high table could, by day's end, have fed a courtier, sustained a guardsman, filled a scullion, and kept a pauper's family alive for one more night. The royal kitchen did not just feed a king, it fueled an entire micro-economy of patronage, where every scrap had a purpose and every bite reinforced the absolute hierarchical order of the world. Deep within the palace's culinary city, far from the roaring spits and simmering saucepans, stood a kingdom ruled by flour and sugar. The royal baker and confectioner were not just cooks, they were architects of daily necessity and masters of edible dreams. Their work began in the cold, silent hours before dawn, with the most fundamental division of all, bread. For the king's own table, the baker crafted manchet, the finest white bread imaginable. This was not the rustic loaf of the common man. Manchet was made from wheat flour, sieved multiple times to remove every speck of bran, mixed with the purest water, the best yeast, and a touch of milk or butter. The dough was kneaded with meticulous care, shaped into small, soft rolls, and baked to a delicate, golden perfection. Its texture was light, its crumb fine and white as snow. This was the bread of privilege, a silent but powerful statement that even the king's most basic sustenance was refined beyond ordinary reach. Meanwhile, in another part of the vast bakery, ovens the size of small rooms produced the coarse, dark bread for the rest of the household. Made from rye or barley, often mixed with beans or peas, this dense, hearty loaf was the fuel that powered the palace's human engine. From this simple, daily dichotomy of manchet and maslin, one could read the entire social order of the court. While the baker sustained the body, the confectioner delighted the soul and dazzled the eye. His domain was the kingdom of sugar, the most precious and versatile ingredient in the royal larder. His daily tasks were a blend of chemistry, art, and preservation. He transformed bitter citrus peels and hard fruits into glistening jewels through the slow, careful process of candying, bathing them in repeated syrups until they became translucent, sweet treasures that could be stored for months. He cooked fruits with sugar into rich, jewel-toned preserves, capturing the taste of summer to brighten the winter table. But his true artistry shone in the grand finales of the feast. He crafted the intricate sugar plate subtleties, yes, but he also composed the earliest forms of what we would recognize as dessert. Imagine a silken syllabub, a frothy, elegant confection of sweetened wine or cider whipped with fresh cream into a cloud of delicate flavor. Or consider a grand trifle, layers of manchet bread soaked in sack, a sweet wine, rich custard, jam, and whipped cream, a luxurious mosaic of textures in a single glass bowl. These were not mere sweets, they were edible sonnets that concluded the symphony of a feast. The confectioner's creations offered a final, perfect note, a taste of pure, unadulterated pleasure that lingered on the palate long after the last platter was cleared, reminding every guest that the king's bounty was ultimately a source of wonder. The lingering sweetness of sugar and cream could never quench a deeper, more constant thirst. In a world where water from public wells or even palace cisterns was viewed with deep suspicion, the royal table relied on a liquid hierarchy as complex as its food. Ale and beer were the true water of the age, the safe, daily hydration for every soul in the palace, from the scullery maid to the king himself. Brewed in vast quantities in the palace's own brewery, these were not the heavy, intoxicating drinks we imagine today. Small beer, with a very low alcohol content, was consumed throughout the day by all, including children. It was nourishing, made from fermented grains, and crucially, the brewing process killed harmful pathogens. This was the lifeblood of the household, a steady, sobering stream that fueled the work of the court. But for the high table, such common brews were merely sustenance. Status was poured from a different vessel. The royal wine cellar was a fortress of prestige, its vaulted corridors holding barrels and bottles that represented alliances, territories, and immense wealth. Wines from specific regions, like Gascony or the Rhine, were prized, their acquisition a matter of state commerce. Yet even this luxury was rarely consumed plain. The most common presentation was hippocras, a spiced and sweetened wine that served as the perfect finale to a grand meal. The court apothecary or a trusted steward would mix fine wine with a costly blend of ground cinnamon, ginger, sugar, and sometimes grains of paradise, then strain it through a cloth bag called a manicum hippocraticum, giving the drink its name. Served warm in cold weather or chilled in summer, hippocras was believed to aid digestion and showcase the kingdom's access to the world's spices in liquid form. This carefully managed world of ale and wine, however, was forever altered by a new wave of exotic arrivals. In the 17th and 18th centuries, coffee, tea, and chocolate stormed the courts of Europe as thrilling, expensive, and controversial novelties. They were medicines, status symbols, and social elixirs rolled into one. Coffee, brewed from dark beans and served in specialized houses and later in palace salons, sparked conversation and political debate. Tea, arriving from the East in delicate porcelain caddies, became a ritual of refined femininity and immense expense, its leaves sometimes even locked away by the mistress of the household. And chocolate, consumed as a thick, spiced, and often bitter drink, was hailed as an aphrodisiac and a fortifying breakfast for nobles. Each sip of these new commodities told a story of global empires and changing tastes, a quiet revolution in a cup that slowly began to rival the centuries-old dominion of wine. From the servant's ration of small beer to the king's spiced hippocras and his queen's precious sip of chocolate, every drink served was a calculated act, reinforcing rank and revealing how a palace truly quenched its thirst. But for all its splendor, the royal kitchen was also a world of stark human calculus, where a cook's life balanced on a razor's edge between privilege and peril. The wages for a master chef in a great palace could be surprisingly generous, often exceeding those of a mid-level court official. This was not just payment for skill, it was hush money, a financial incentive to ensure loyalty in a place rife with temptation. Yet coin was only part of the compensation. A cook's most valuable perk was the ancient right to orts, the official leftovers from the preparation process. These were not the scraps from the king's plate, but the trimmings from the kitchen, the extra bits of meat, the ends of vegetables, the broken pastries. For a skilled cook, these orts could be cleverly repurposed into substantial meals for their own family or sold for a tidy profit in the city, a perfectly legal side income that made the position deeply coveted. This system of sanctioned scraps created a delicate ecosystem of its own, where a cook's household might eat better than a minor noble's. But the line between sanctioned orts and outright theft was perilously thin, and the kitchen presented endless opportunity. A sack of precious saffron could lose a few precious strands to a cook's hidden pouch. A side of bacon might mysteriously shed a few pounds before it reached the spit. The theft of kitchen stuff, as it was called, was a constant low-grade war between the cooks and the vigilant clerk of the kitchen, whose ledgers were a map of suspected pilferage. The stakes of this game, however, went far beyond a missing chicken. A cook's entire fate, his wealth, his freedom, even his life, hung on the single, volatile variable of the monarch's satisfaction. A perfectly seasoned dish that pleased the king could bring a shower of gold coins, a gift of fine cloth, or a coveted promotion. The cook might be summoned to the royal presence to receive personal thanks, a moment of glory that would echo through the servant halls for weeks. But the inverse was terrifyingly true. A failed sauce, an overcooked roast, or even a meal that simply failed to spark the king's appetite on a gloomy day could mean instant dismissal, a beating, or imprisonment. In the most extreme cases, if a dish was suspected of causing illness, whether by accident or alleged malice, the cook could face charges of treason, a crime punishable by agonizing public execution. Thus, every day in the royal kitchen was a high-wire act. A cook wielded the power to shape flavors that could sway politics, yet he lived with the knowledge that his art could, in a heartbeat, become his indictment. His hands that crafted delicate subtleties were the same hands that might one day be bound by rope. This was the ultimate price of touching the king's food, a life of measured luxury shadowed by the constant, chilling whisper of the executioner's axe. The shadow of the axe was longest in the most brilliant palace of all. To understand the daily reality of a royal cook, we must walk the marble halls and chaotic kitchens of Versailles under Louis XIV. Here, the general principles we have explored were not just practiced, they were perfected into a daily, high-stakes performance for the most demanding audience in Europe. The Sun King did not merely eat, he dined as theater, and his kitchen was the stage. His personal tastes were famously robust, favoring garlic, onions, and strong, reduced sauces that could stand up to his vigorous appetite. A typical grand dinner for him alone, known as the Grand Couvert where he ate in public view, might officially include 4 different soups, 2 whole roasted fowls, a vast array of entrees like pies and ragouts, and multiple desserts. But this was just the visible tip of an edible iceberg. Versailles was not a home, it was the engine of state, and its kitchens had to feed the entire machinery. On any given day, the palace population could swell to over 5,000 nobles, officials, servants, and guards, all expected to be fed according to their rank. The numbers are staggering. Accounts show the kitchens routinely preparing over 150 different dishes for the upper tables each day. They might consume 300 baskets of peaches in a season, use thousands of eggs weekly, and roast dozens of sheep and oxen daily just to keep pace. This scale demanded a military operation. The main kitchen complex, the Grand Commune, was a separate building housing multiple kitchens and hundreds of staff. For the king's own meals, prepared in the more intimate cuisine du roi near his apartments, the pressure was absolute. Every movement was timed to the minute. The king's dinner was served precisely at 10 o'clock in the evening. A system of bells and runners coordinated the final assembly, ensuring that a soup that began simmering at dawn and a pastry that went into the oven an hour ago would arrive at the royal table in perfect harmony, both at the peak of their flavor and temperature. The most famous account comes from the Duke of St. Simon, who described the nightly ritual. As the king prepared to sit, a procession would form. The royal taster led the way, followed by the controller general of the mouth, then a line of guards, courtiers, and finally the servers carrying the covered dishes. They marched through the glittering hall of mirrors, a parade of sustenance moving through a gallery of reflected power. The silence of their march was broken only by the command, for the king, which cleared their path. Once the food was presented and assayed publicly, Louis would eat with brisk efficiency, rarely taking more than half an hour for even the grandest meal. For the cooks, this was the moment of truth. They had navigated a day of insane logistics, managed a fortune in ingredients, and balanced the volatile preferences of a monarch who saw a mediocre dish as a slight to his majesty. A success meant they survived another day in the Sun King's orbit. A failure meant vanishing from that golden world forever. In Versailles, the daily preparation of food was the heartbeat of power, a relentless, precise, and magnificent proof that the state, quite literally, ran on its stomach. If Versailles was a theater of precision, the Tudor court of Henry VIII was a carnival of consumption. Here, the royal kitchen's purpose was not subtle spectacle, but overwhelming, visceral power. The numbers from Henry's household accounts defy belief. In a single year, his court consumed over 1,200 oxen, over 8,000 sheep, and more than 2,000 deer. This was not merely eating, it was a form of political architecture, building the king's authority one gargantuan roast at a time. The sheer tonnage of meat was a direct symbol of his virility and strength. a performance of masculinity meant to silence any doubt about the king's vigor or his right to rule. At the heart of this carnivorous display was venison. More than just food, it was the ultimate status symbol. A gift of a haunch of deer from the king's own hunt was a mark of high favor, a tangible piece of royal privilege. The hunt itself was a rigorous, masculine ritual, and the bounty it brought to the table connected the king directly to his wild, untamed lands. His kitchens would prepare it in every conceivable way, roasted on great spits, baked into monumental pies, or stewed in rich, heavily spiced gravies. But the menu stretched far beyond game. Boar's head, garnished with bay and rosemary, was a traditional centerpiece for Christmas feasts, representing the conquest of the wild. Swans and peacocks, redressed in their feathers, continued to grace the table as living heraldry, and the oceans of beef, mutton, and poultry spoke of agricultural wealth, of fields and flocks entirely at the monarch's command. Feasting was a core instrument of Tudor statecraft. A grand banquet was a microcosm of the kingdom's hierarchy, with every guest's seat and portion carefully calibrated to reflect their standing. The sheer, staggering abundance broadcast an unmistakable message. A king who could provide such limitless bounty was a king of limitless power. To dine at Henry's court was to be submerged in a sensory proof of his sovereignty, where the aroma of roasting meat was the smell of political certainty, and the act of carving a joint was as weighty as signing a treaty. This was power served on a platter, a daily, edible empire. This relentless pursuit of culinary power, however, was constantly tempered by a far more intimate concern: the fragile health of the monarch. In an age before modern medicine, food was not just fuel or spectacle, it was the primary medicine. Every royal cook was, by necessity, a practical physician, guided by a medical doctrine that had ruled Western thought for over 1,000 years, the theory of the four humors. This system taught that the human body was governed by four vital fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health was a perfect balance of these humors, and illness was an excess or deficiency of one. Every ingredient in the royal larder was classified not just by taste, but by its innate qualities, its power to heat, cool, moisten, or dry the body. A fever, seen as an excess of hot and dry yellow bile, demanded a cooling, moistening diet. The king might be prescribed dishes of lettuce, cucumbers, and freshwater fish, all considered cold and moist, and told to avoid hot spices like pepper and ginger. Conversely, a ruler suffering from melancholy, linked to an excess of cold, dry black bile, would need heating foods to restore balance. His cooks would prepare game meats, garlic, onions, and generous use of warming spices like cinnamon and cloves. This was not a matter of preference. It was a medical prescription that overruled even the most extravagant menu. The master cook had to be a maestro of balance, creating dishes that satisfied the political need for opulence while strictly adhering to the royal physician's latest diagnosis. Some monarchs became defined by these dietary battles. England's Queen Elizabeth I, facing digestive troubles in her later years, relied heavily on manchet bread and pottages, easy to digest and considered neutral in humor. She had a famous sweet tooth, but her physicians likely argued that sugary confections, considered moist and cooling, could imbalance her constitution if taken in excess. The kitchen's daily challenge was to make her prescribed, simple foods appear regal. Across the Channel, King Louis XIV of France suffered from agonizing gout, a condition believed to be caused by an overindulgence in rich, heating foods and wines. His doctors would periodically enforce brutal purges and strict diets, stripping his table of the very red meats and heavy sauces he loved. His cooks then had to perform their greatest act of deception, creating lavish feasts of permitted foods, perhaps ingeniously sculpting fish to look like ham or crafting rich-tasting sauces from almonds and herbs, all to maintain the illusion of boundless royal bounty even as the king sipped a bland broth. This constant negotiation between medicine and majesty meant the royal table was a living document of the monarch's body, its changing menus a secret record of private suffering, and the endless, quiet struggle to keep the most important person in the kingdom alive for one more day. A king's marriage was a treaty written in spices and served on a plate. When a foreign princess crossed the border to become queen, she did not arrive alone. She brought with her an entire culinary world, a retinue of tastes that could reshape a nation's palate overnight. These royal unions were the most powerful vectors for culinary change, transforming the royal kitchen from a bastion of tradition into a laboratory of fusion. Food became soft power, a delicious diplomacy where a new sauce could signal a new alliance. Consider the transformative impact of Catherine de' Medici's arrival in France from Italy in the 16th century. She did not just bring her chefs, she brought a culinary revolution. The French court, accustomed to heavy spicing and straightforward roasts, was introduced to the refined elegance of Italian Renaissance cuisine. Catherine's cooks introduced the fork, a scandalous novelty that promoted cleaner, more delicate eating. They championed artichokes, broccoli, and delicate lettuces, elevating vegetables from mere pottage filler to curated side dishes. They brought techniques like the delicate bechamel sauce, the precursor to bechamel, and a new appreciation for frozen desserts and elaborate sugar work. Almost overnight, the French royal table became lighter, more varied, and aesthetically precise, laying the very groundwork for what would become haute cuisine. This was not a simple change of menu, it was a cultural conquest by consent, where France eagerly adopted the tastes of its new queen. Similarly, when the Spanish Princess Anne of Austria married Louis XIII of France, the Spanish love for chocolate infiltrated the French court. What began as a curious, bitter drink favored by the new queen soon became a fashionable obsession, spawning its own rituals and specialized servants. Decades later, her son, Louis XIV, would solidify the Spanish alliance by marrying Maria Theresa of Spain, further entrenching these trans-Pyrenean tastes. Each royal bride was a living trade route, her personal preferences opening diplomatic channels for ingredients that would eventually trickle down to the merchant classes. Exotic spices, once locked in the royal larder as symbols of mere wealth, now carried the specific fragrance of a political bond. A demand for Spanish saffron or Italian citrus could strengthen a trade agreement, while a snub of a certain region's wine could quietly sour relations. The royal kitchen staff, always watching the monarch's plate, learned to decode these edible messages. A request for a Hungarian paprika sauce might hint at negotiations with the Habsburgs, while a sudden abundance of Dutch butter could signal a naval pact. In this way, the daily menu became a living document of foreign policy, a feast that could either cement an alliance or reveal a growing rift. The marriage of two people could, quite literally, change the taste of an era, proving that the most enduring conquests are sometimes achieved not with swords, but with soufflés and spoonfuls of new, unforgettable flavor. The king's plate was a masterpiece of illusion, but was his appetite ever truly his own? Behind every grand feast lay a more mundane reality, a rigid calendar of meals planned not by whim, but by a committee of stewards, physicians, and political advisors days, sometimes weeks, in advance. The idea of a monarch pointing to a pheasant and demanding it for dinner was largely a fantasy. In truth, the royal menu was a complex negotiation, a tightrope walk between personal desire and unyielding protocol. On one side stood the king's genuine cravings, perhaps a longing for a simple dish from his childhood or a sudden fancy for early strawberries. These fleeting wishes were noted by attentive servants and, if possible, indulged, for a happy king was a stable king. Yet these personal touches were mere ornaments on a pre-built structure. The overwhelming framework of the menu was dictated by three powerful forces: ceremony, health, and season. Court ceremony was an immutable script. A state visit from a Spanish ambassador demanded a display of French culinary prowess, heavy on luxuries like truffles and fine wines. A religious feast day required a lavish fish banquet. The weekly schedule itself was fixed, with certain days designated for certain types of meals, leaving little room for spontaneous change. Then came the royal physician, whose word was medical law. If the king was suffering from gout, as Louis XIV often did, all rich sauces and red meat would vanish from his table, replaced by broths and boiled fowl, regardless of what he might want. His cravings were overruled by the humoral need to cool and purify his blood. Finally, and most fundamentally, was the silent dictator of the kitchen, the season. Before global shipping, you ate what was ripe, slaughtered, or preserved. A craving for fresh peas in December was an impossibility, a financial absurdity. The menu was a prisoner of the harvest calendar, the migration of game birds, and the success of the local fishermen. So was every meal a predictable performance. In its broad strokes, absolutely. The court knew that Tuesday's dinner would likely feature the boar hunted on Monday, that Lenten Fridays would bring pike from the royal ponds, and that the first strawberries of June would appear as a celebrated delicacy. The surprise, then, was not in the main ingredients, but in the execution. The king's choice was not what to eat, but how well it was prepared. His power lay in his reaction, in the nod of approval that could make a chef's career or the dismissive wave that could end one. The real menu was not a list of dishes, but a daily test of the kitchen's ability to make the inevitable feel miraculous, to transform the predictable bounty of the season and the demands of state into a fresh spectacle of power and pleasure. The king's approval could launch a recipe into history, but its final journey was far from over. That meticulously balanced sauce, that sculpted subtlety, did not vanish when the last courtier left the hall. Instead, it began a slow, fascinating migration from the gilded palace to the public square, transforming from a symbol of exclusive power into a shared national heritage. This trickle-down effect found its most powerful engine in a surprising object, the published cookbook. For centuries, culinary knowledge was locked within palace walls, passed as guarded secrets from master to apprentice. But in the 17th and 18th centuries, a new phenomenon emerged. Retired royal chefs began writing down their secrets for profit. These men, having survived the pressure of the royal kitchen, saw an opportunity. A growing, literate middle class, merchants, lawyers, and prosperous farmers, hungered not just for food, but for the taste of status. They wanted to eat like a king, or at least to feel like they could. Cookbooks by former masters of the royal kitchen became bestsellers. They offered more than recipes. They offered a fantasy, a tangible piece of the palace you could recreate in your own dining room. The most famous example is perhaps François-Pierre de la Varenne, chef to the French Marquis d'Uxelles, whose 1651 cookbook, Le Cuisinier François, is considered a founding text of modern French cuisine. While not a king's chef directly, his work codified the refined, less heavily spiced style that had evolved in noble kitchens, moving away from medieval excess toward the emphasis on the natural flavors of ingredients, delicate sauces, and precise technique that defined royal tables after the Medici influence. His recipes for a light roux-based sauce or a perfectly roasted chicken were no longer secrets. They were instructions available to anyone who could read and afford the book. This democratization of technique was revolutionary. The middle-class housewife could now attempt a bisque or a ragout, terms and methods once known only to the king's saucer. The presentation ideas, too, filtered down. While a bourgeois family could not afford a sugar sculpture of a warship, they could aspire to mold a simple gelid dessert into an elegant shape or garnish a platter with parsley in a style mimicking court fashion. Dishes themselves began this journey. What was once a royal necessity, like the elaborate fast day fish pies, became a celebratory centerpiece for a merchant family's Friday dinner, a way to display both piety and newfound sophistication. Over generations, this process of adaptation accelerated. The rich, spiced hippocras served at the king's table became the mulled wine of Christmas markets. The delicate, almond-based blancmange, a staple of medieval royal feasts, evolved into the comforting rice puddings and custards of later centuries. The entire concept of courses, of serving soup before meat and finishing with a sweet, was a direct inheritance from the rigid structure of the royal service. This was not a simple copy, but a process of translation. Palace recipes were simplified. Expensive ingredients like saffron were replaced with more affordable alternatives like turmeric or safflower, and the staggering scale was reduced to feed a family of 10, not a court of 1,000. Yet the aspiration remained, the ghost of royal taste guiding the national palate. So the next time you sit down to a meal that follows a particular order, or enjoy a sauce that balances richness and acidity, or even use a cooking term borrowed from French, you are tasting the long, slow legacy of the royal kitchen. The king's dinner did not just feed a court, it eventually taught a nation how to dream of flavor, one adapted recipe at a time. The royal kitchen was a universe where artistry met sheer, grinding logistics. Every dawn, a small army of specialists woke to perform an impossible daily miracle. They were chemists balancing the humors in a sauce, artists sculpting fantasies from sugar, and logisticians moving mountains of food with military precision, all while the shadow of disgrace or worse hung over every pot and pan. Their work was never just about sustenance. It was the edible engine of power, a tool for healing the king's fragile body, a stage for the grandest political theater, and a delicate system that ensured the survival of the monarch, the court, and even the paupers at the gate. They translated treaties into spices and fears of poison into rituals of trust. So we leave you with this final thought. If you could step into those bustling, smoky kitchens for just one day, which role would you choose? Would you dare to be the saucier, gambling a fortune of saffron on a single reduction? Or the royal baker, knowing the king's bread must be perfect? Perhaps you'd rather face the terrifying silence of the tasting room. Tell us in the comments, what single dish from a royal table would you most want to try? Or which one would you absolutely avoid? The feast of history is waiting for your verdict.